October 15th, 1945, 2:47 in the afternoon, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The autumn wind carries dust across the barbed wire, and through that wire, 37 German women watch something they've never seen before. Black American soldiers, bowing their heads, closing their eyes, whispering words to a God they were told these men couldn't possibly know. The mess hall falls silent, except for the whispered prayers drifting across the compound. For 17 seconds, no one moves. Not the guards. Not the prisoners. Not even the sparrows that usually fight over scattered crumbs. Ingrid Weber presses her face closer to the fence. Her breath fogs the cold metal. She watches Sergeant Williams fold his massive hands, the same hands that carried wounded soldiers across battlefields, now gentle as a child's before sleep. What she sees next will haunt her dreams, not with nightmares, but with questions she was never supposed to ask. In war, we learn to see enemies, but sometimes enemies teach us to see God. This is the story of what happened when the defeated watched their captors pray and discovered that humanity doesn't recognize uniforms, doesn't speak languages, doesn't choose sides. It only appears in moments when we think no one is watching. When grace finds its way through barbed wire and broken hearts. Camp Concordia housed something unusual in 1945. Not just German prisoners of war, but German women. Nurses, clerks, radio operators captured during the final collapse of the Reich. They expected harsh treatment. They expected revenge. They expected everything, except what they found. The 369th Infantry Regiment had been assigned guard duty. Black soldiers from Harlem, Detroit, Chicago, men who had fought fascism abroad only to return to segregation at home. Men who knew what it meant to be considered less than human. And now they were guarding women who had been taught that very lesson about them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The army's racial logic had placed its inferior soldiers in charge of Hitler's superior race. What the generals didn't anticipate was what would happen when two groups who understood persecution met across a fence designed to divide them. Military protocol demanded distance. Regulations forbade fraternization. The system was designed to maintain clear boundaries between victors and vanquished, between white and black, between us and them. But faith has a way of ignoring boundaries. Every meal began the same way. The mess hall bell would ring at precisely 1800 hours. 143 black soldiers would file in, tired from guard duty, construction work, the endless tasks that peace somehow demanded more than war. They would find their seats at long wooden tables scarred by countless meals, countless conversations, countless moments of human connection in a place designed to prevent exactly that. Then, silence. Not the silence of military discipline, not the quiet of exhausted men too tired to speak, but the intentional silence of prayer, of gratitude, of men who had seen too much death to take life for granted, even the simple life of a warm meal at the end of another day. Ingrid Weber had been watching for 3 weeks before she understood what she was seeing. Ingrid had served as a nurse in Hamburg before the war consumed everything she had known about healing, about helping, about hope. The Nazis had taught her that medicine was about racial purity, that some lives were worth saving and others were not. She had learned to check patient records for the stamps that determined who deserved morphine and who deserved less. But watching these black soldiers pray before every meal, she remembered something she had forgotten. Her grandmother's voice, teaching her to say grace before Sunday dinner. The way her grandmother's hands would shake slightly as she whispered thanks for bread that sometimes wasn't enough, but was what they had. Through the fence, she watched Sergeant Williams bow his head. His lips moved in words she couldn't hear, but somehow recognized. The cadence of gratitude, the rhythm of faith, the same rhythm her grandmother had taught her before the world went mad. One evening, Ingrid found herself whispering along. Not the words. She didn't know their words. But the feeling, the acknowledgement that somewhere above the barbed wire and guard towers and broken dreams, something larger was listening. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday. Corporal Johnson noticed that one of the German women hadn't appeared at the fence for 3 days. Brunhilde Stein, a radio operator from Bremen, had been suffering from pneumonia that the camp's limited medical supplies couldn't quite cure. She lay in the women's barracks, coughing until blood spotted her handkerchief. Convinced she would die in this foreign place, forgotten by God and country alike. Johnson had seen pneumonia kill soldiers stronger than this small woman. He had watched good men die for lack of medicine that existed. Somewhere else. Always. Somewhere else. That Tuesday evening, instead of eating his regulation meal of beef stew and cornbread, Johnson walked to the fence. Through the wire, he passed his portion to Ingrid Weber. Not because regulations allowed it, they didn't. Not because his commanding officer approved. He wouldn't. But because a sick woman needed food more than a healthy man needed protocol. The other soldiers watched. Some shook their heads. Some understood. All of them learned something about the man they served beside. But it was what happened next that no one expected. Brunhilde Stein survived. And the first words she spoke when her fever broke weren't German. They were English. Broken, hesitant English she had learned from listening to her captor's conversations through thin barracks walls. "Thank you," she whispered when Johnson passed the fence during his next patrol. "Thank you for seeing me." Johnson stopped walking. For a moment, the universe contracted to the space between a black soldier from Detroit and a German woman from Bremen. Two people who were supposed to be enemies, learning that enemies are just strangers who haven't discovered what they share. "We all God's children," Johnson said quietly. "Ain't no uniform changes that." Helma Kruger had stopped believing in God sometime during the bombing of Dresden. She had been there when the fire came down from the sky like judgment, consuming everything that had ever made her feel safe. Her church, her school, the bakery where her father had worked since she was small enough to steal rolls from cooling racks when no one was looking. When the Americans captured her unit near the Elbe River, Helma had decided that if God existed, he had chosen sides, and her side had lost. But watching these black soldiers pray, she began to wonder if God might be more complicated than sides. Every evening, she pressed against the fence and watched their ritual. The way they removed their caps before eating. The way their voices joined together in words she couldn't understand but somehow felt. The way they included absent friends in their prayers. Men who wouldn't be coming home. Whose chairs remained empty but not forgotten. Slowly, Helma began to remember her own prayers. Not the prayers the Nazis had tried to replace with party slogans and racial ideology, but the prayers her mother had taught her. Simple words about daily bread and forgiveness and the hope that tomorrow might be better than today. One evening, as the soldiers prayed, Helma found her own lips moving, not with their words, but with her own. Words she had thought she had forgotten. Words that had survived everything, even her decision to stop believing. Vater unser, der du bist im Himmel. Jude, the Lord's Prayer in German, whispered through barbed wire, joining with English prayers from men she had been taught to hate. And in that moment, Helma understood something that no political ideology had ever taught her. Faith wasn't about nation or race or who won wars. Faith was about connection to something larger than the terrible things humans do to each other, to the possibility that love might be stronger than the hatred that seems so much easier. December 24th, 1945. Christmas Eve in a prisoner of war camp in Kansas feels like the edge of the world. Snow covers the compound in silence that makes everything look peaceful, almost beautiful, if you forget about the wire. The German women had been preparing for a Christmas without celebration. No trees, no carols, no sense that the birth of hope was worth acknowledging in a place where hope seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. But at 1900 hours, something unexpected happened. Sergeant Williams approached the fence carrying a small portable radio. Behind him, 43 black soldiers formed a semicircle and began to sing, "Silent Night, Holy Night." The familiar melody drifted across the compound, transformed by voices that had learned harmony in churches across America. In communities where singing was how you survived everything life took from you. Through the fence, Ingrid Weber began to cry, not from sadness, but from recognition. She knew this song. Every German child knew this song. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht had been written in Austria more than a century ago, had traveled the world, had become the prayer of everyone who needed to believe that peace was possible. One by one, the German women began to sing along. Not in English, in German. The same words, the same hope, the same acknowledgement that some things are larger than the languages we use to hurt each other. For 4 minutes, on a snowy Christmas Eve, the fence disappeared. There were no guards and prisoners, no victors and vanquished, no black and white and German and American. There were only voices joining together in a song about the birth of hope in a world that desperately needed hope. When the song ended, the silence was different. Not empty, but full. Full of the recognition that humanity had survived another year, another war, another attempt to convince people that some lives matter less than others. Sergeant Williams nodded to the women through the fence. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. "Fröhliche Weihnachten," Ingrid whispered back. And in that exchange, something healed that hadn't even realized it was broken. The letters began arriving in Germany in January 1946. Ingrid Weber wrote to her sister in Hamburg, "The Americans are not what we were told, especially the black soldiers. They pray before every meal. They share their food when someone is sick. They sing hymns on Sunday evenings that sound like our grandmother's songs, but in words that carry pain we never understood." Helma Kruger wrote to her mother in what remained of Dresden, "I have learned to pray again. Not because the war is over, but because I watched men pray who had every reason to stop believing, and didn't. They taught me that faith is not about winning or losing. It's about remembering that every day we wake up is a gift." Trudy, Brunhilde Stein wrote to her former commanding officer, "You told us these men were animals. You were wrong. They are the most human people I have ever met. They see enemies and choose to find neighbors. They face hatred and respond with hymns. I don't understand their God, but I want to." These letters traveled across an ocean still littered with the debris of war, carrying a message that no one had anticipated. Sometimes those we defeat teach us how to be victorious. Sometimes those we capture set us free. Sometimes those we're taught to hate show us how to love. The irony was devastating and beautiful. Here were women who had been indoctrinated in the superiority of their race, learning humanity from men their ideology claimed were subhuman. Here were soldiers who faced discrimination at home, demonstrating the very values their own country struggled to practice. Here were enemies, discovering they served the same God. The American military had intended Camp Concordia as a place of detention, control, punishment. Instead, it became something unexpected, a laboratory for grace. A place where the barriers that politics creates crumble when humans choose to see humans instead of categories, individuals instead of ideologies, children of God instead of children of war. Every evening meal became a lesson in the possibility that hatred is learned and can be unlearned, that prejudice is taught and can be untaught, that the worst things we believe about each other are usually the lies we tell ourselves to justify the terrible things we do. But what happened in that Kansas camp spread beyond barbed wire. When the German women were repatriated in spring 1946, they carried more than memories. They carried a different understanding of who their captors had been and who they themselves might become. In rebuilt churches across Germany, in conversations with neighbors still struggling to understand how their nation had lost its way, they shared stories of Black American soldiers who prayed before meals and shared food with sick enemies and sang hymns that sounded like hope. These stories challenged every assumption the Nazi ideology had planted. If these Black soldiers were inferior, why did they demonstrate superior compassion? If Germans were superior, why did they need to learn basic humanity from their supposed racial inferiors? The questions were uncomfortable, which meant they were the right questions to ask. Years later, when Ingrid Weber became a nurse again in the New Germany, she would tell her patients about the Christmas Eve when enemies sang Silent Night together through barbed wire. When Helma Kruger married and raised children, she taught them prayers she had relearned from watching soldiers who had every reason to stop believing, but didn't. The ripples spread farther than anyone counted. A story here, a conversation there, a different way of seeing the world that expanded with each retelling. The recognition that grace appears in unexpected places, through unexpected people, when we stop looking for enemies and start looking for neighbors. October 15th, 1945, 2:47 in the afternoon. But now we understand what Ingrid Weber really saw through that fence. Not just Black soldiers praying before meals, but proof that humanity survives every attempt to destroy it. Evidence that faith transcends the boundaries we build to keep each other apart. A demonstration that love is stronger than the hatred that seems so much easier to choose. She watched men bow their heads in gratitude for food they had earned through service to a country that didn't always serve them back. She saw soldiers whisper thanks for life they had almost lost in battles, fought for freedoms they couldn't fully claim at home. She witnessed the daily miracle of people who choose grace over grievance, hope over hatred, prayer over payback. And in watching them, she remembered who she had been before the world taught her to be afraid of differences, suspicious of strangers, convinced that some people deserved less consideration than others. The mess hall still stands in what was once Camp Concordia. It's a museum now, telling the story of German prisoners of war in America during World War II. Visitors can see the long wooden tables, the kitchen where meals were prepared, the windows that look out toward where the women's compound once stood. But they can't see what really happened there. The daily transformation of enemies into neighbors through the simple act of witnessed prayer. The quiet revolution of Black soldiers teaching German women that humanity recognizes no uniform, claims no nationality, speaks every language of the heart. They can't see Ingrid Weber pressing her face to cold wire, learning to believe again in something larger than war. They can't hear Helma Kruger whispering German prayers that joined with English hymns in harmonies that heaven understood even when earth couldn't. They can't witness the Christmas Eve when 43 black soldiers and 37 German women proved that some songs are stronger than the silences that try to separate us. But the lesson remains, echoing through decades, waiting for anyone willing to listen. Sometimes the people we're taught to fear are the ones God sends to teach us how to love. Sometimes those we defeat show us what victory actually means. Sometimes those we guard become the ones who set us free. In a world that still struggles with the barriers between us and them, between different and dangerous, between stranger and enemy, the story of Camp Concordia whispers a different possibility. That every fence can become a meeting place, that every boundary can become a bridge, that every enemy carries the possibility of becoming family. If stories like this remind you that grace appears in the most unexpected places, through the most unlikely people, when love chooses to be stronger than fear, then perhaps there are other moments of witnessed faith worth remembering, other prayers worth joining, other songs worth singing together across whatever wires try to keep us apart.